Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Is that better? For those who may not know me, my name is John Thompson. I'm Professor Emeritus in Biology and also the Associate Vice President of Research here at the University of Waterloo. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this information and consultation session on a new initiative that is being launched by the Tri-Agency. The new initiative has been dubbed Renewal of the Tri-Agency Financial Administration. And that should be good news for all of us that they're undertaking this. Waterloo is one of several institutions that have been selected for piloting this new initiative, and I'm pleased to extend a very warm welcome indeed to our two guests from the Tri-Agency who will explain how this new system is going to work and also what our role as a pilot institution is going to be. First, Scott Woodruff. Scott is the Manager Financial Operations and Procurement at CIHR, and as well Nathalie Manceau. Nathalie is Director General Finance from SSHRC and also from NSERC. Welcome to both of you. We're delighted to have you here. My understanding of this new strategy, limited though it is, and hopefully to be confirmed by Scott and Nathalie, I'm getting it second and third hand, you see, so is that the new initiative is designed to reduce the financial administrative burden of managing tri-agency funds, both for researchers and also for institutions. And if you can achieve that, mind you, it'll be wonderful. It really will. And that there will be a focus in this new initiative on really three areas. First of all, moving to a less directive approach for the administration and use of grant funds. Next, revising the agency's approach to financial monitoring reviews, and as well, increasing the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the post-award administration of grants. And I understand the session this morning is going to focus on the following specific topics. First, an overview of the renewal initiative and progress to date, and Scott's going to bring us up to date on that. Secondly, roles and responsibilities of grant recipients and administering institutions for the administration of grants. Third, and this is very important, seeking feedback from us on the issues that we as grant recipients encounter and as administrators of grants when using and managing grant funds. Fourth, understanding the source of these issues and brainstorming on how to potentially resolve them. And finally, next steps in the pilot project at Waterloo. So again, a warm welcome to Nathalie and Scott. We're delighted to have you here. And finally, I would like to take this opportunity to identify and introduce the two leads on this renewal initiative from the University of Waterloo, and they are Diane Johnson, Director of Research Finance, and Leslie Kopp, Director of Funding Agencies and Nonprofit Sponsors. Thank you, Leslie and Diane, for your work on this file. And with that, let me simply close by saying that we look forward to a productive set of meetings over the next 2 days. You are going to be here for 2 full days, right? 2 days. You might cut out early on Friday. Okay, thanks very much, and over to you, Scott.
Perfect. That's okay, yeah, I've got one here. Well, thank you very much. So thank you to you for taking a few minutes out of your schedule to come chat with us. Greatly appreciated. So the first couple of slides is really an overview of the initiative, which has already been done, which is fantastic. So just to jump in, I'm just going to go over why we're here, why we're consulting you, what are we doing, and how it impacts you for the most part. So the background of why we're doing this initiative. In recent years, the Tri-Agency had, in the monitoring visits, the comment that we got back numerous times is we're very strict, too strict maybe, looking at low dollar transactions, low risk transactions. In a nutshell, we had three people from the Tri-Agencies sitting in a room looking at invoices, arguing, debating whether, example, the purchase of a Sharpie is an eligible expense. Don't know about you, but I don't think it's a good use of our time, the administering institution's time, your time. So that's kind of the idea as to what we're trying to get away from. We want to be seen as less as auditors and more as a partner in helping the administering institution actually helping manage grant funds. How do we do that? Well, we have to put the trust in the grant recipients. To be completely honest, you guys put the applications in. You guys won the funding. You guys know what's best, what expenditures are best to put towards your specific research. So there has to be an increased level of trust there, as well as you might be aware, the Naylor report back in 2017 talking about how we should be harmonizing the tri-agency approach. So right now, if you look at the tri-agency guide as it is now, yes, it's one document for all three agencies. However, you see a lot of SHRC only, NSHRC only, CIHR only. So it's not really a tri-agency document. So again, we're trying to get away from that aspect and try to have like a more consistent document for all three agencies. As mentioned a while ago, the initiative really is broken out into three areas. One, moving away from a more prescriptive list of eligible expenses, not non-eligible expenses, which is like the TAFAG. Second part of the initiative is really focused on the financial monitoring piece. I'm not going to get into all that much detail today. It doesn't really affect the grant recipients. It's mostly a relationship between the administering institution and the tri-agency. So I can speak about it real quick, but it's not going to be the focus of our discussion. And finally, just the increase the effectiveness of post-award administration. So that, in a nutshell, means continuous improvement as we go through. Just a quick synopsis of the various shared accountabilities in administering grant funds. So we each have a role to play. So the grant recipients, because you're essentially spending public funds, there is an accountability there. So whenever spending grants and award funding, we have to make sure that the proper authorization is being done by the grant recipient themselves. The administering institutions, because they have the financial controls in place, policies in place to administer other funding, they're there to make sure that the money that's being spent is actually being spent in like the right manner. And at the same time, the administering institution and the tri-agency have an institutional agreement, and in there it says, well, the tri-agency has the due diligence to go and do financial monitoring, make sure that whatever the administering institution is doing makes sense in the fact that to be sure that the money is being spent in the right places on the research. So in a nutshell, we all have a role to play. And that's a quick summary there. In terms of the objectives of the initiative, it was touched upon real briefly. So pretty much, we want to be less directive. We want to get away from the list of eligible, non-eligible expenses and more toward a principles-based approach. So that's number one. Number two is to reduce the burden, increase efficiencies. So depending on the administering institution, we might see various levels of this. Some administering institutions, by osmosis of the tri-agency being strict in the past, some administering institutions are actually pre-auditing everything, absolutely everything, and they're asking for a lot of justification. Whereas others, they're taking a look at, they're actually applying like a risk-based approach, so the normal expenses aren't really scrutinized, as opposed to something that looks, I don't know, ambiguous, I guess I could say, asking for justification. So they're really focusing in on the high dollar value, the high risk items, those that look out of the ordinary. So in that instance, yes, there's going to be some reduced burden, but I think the reduced burden is really going to be on those that are pre-auditing everything. And I don't want to speak for Waterloo. I'm not entirely sure what the approach is. I'm getting no, we don't do that, which is great. Clarification of accountabilities. I just kind of went over it, so we all have a role to play. So just be mindful of what role we each have to play in spending public funds. Modernizing the approach of post-award administration. Again, that's a continuous improvement. Example, potentially automating the Forms 300 at the end of the year. Because right now, from our side of things, CIHR might receive 50 paper copies, whereas the rest of the submissions are via email or via the portal. So it's a little inconsistent at the moment. So as we move through the initiative, we're going to try and increase the efficiencies there to, across the board. As well, the final item is to enhance the clarity of the guidance from the tri-agency. So in the past, example, a question might come to CIHR, say, is this eligible? It's kind of unclear in like the guide. We'd make a ruling and say, you know what, yeah, it is. And a similar question may have went to SHRC and SHRC, same type of expenditure, different program, but same idea. Interpretation may have been a little different. And no, it's not eligible. So it's little inconsistencies there. So by proposing the solution, by proposing a revised principle-based guide, and I'll walk you through as to how we propose that, I think we can enhance the clarity and the consistency in the advice provided as to how to use the grant funding. I'm not going to go over this slide too much. We've already touched about this. Pretty much the three items in red here are the three phases of the initiative, and really what we want to focus on today is the Tri-Agency Financial Administration Guide, how that's changing and how that's going to affect you. So a deeper dive in the Financial Administration Guide, like I said a while ago, we want to streamline and simplify. We want to find a balance between being compliant and being flexible. So moving away from a more prescriptive list, and I have a couple of examples as to how we're actually going to achieve this, how we think we're going to achieve this. Being more flexible without looking at the list saying what's eligible, what's not eligible, asking ourselves the question, is it directly related to research, and just being more open to the type of expenditures. If it fits to the research, it should be eligible. So we're just trying to get away from the more prescriptive lists, and how we're going to do that. I'll get into it again into more detail, but we're going to be relying, instead of relying on those lists of eligible and non-eligible, we'll be relying on the existing financial policies at the administering institution. So that's going to be the go-to document to see is something eligible or not. So to get into how we're going to do this, so the various principles that we're proposing, and again, I've got some additional examples here, but in a nutshell, it's looking at the appropriate use of grant funding, authority to use grant funding, reporting and supporting evidence, oversight of the use of grant funds. In applying these four principles, we're going to apply these to the various directives, so be it travel, hospitality, gifts, compensation. So the directives are there to ensure that even though we're relying on the administrating institution's policies, that we are actually in line with the TB policies, the Treasury Board policies. So before I get into an example, just a couple of further clarifications. One, like I already mentioned, we'll be relying on the administering institution's acquisition policies, requirements, the overall administering institution's policies. And the one thing that I want to point out here is the order of precedence. So the guide that we're going to present to you is really the overarching principle. There are other documents that we'd have to consider. So, example, if we say all compensation expenses are allowable as per the guide, that's great. But if you go down to the funding opportunity and it says allowable expenses are not in the allowable expenditures section, it says compensation for postdocs are not allowable, then the funding opportunity would take precedence over the overarching principles. So it just kind of narrows down where further restrictions are in the various programs. And finally, additional matters. That's going to change from guideline to guideline. So a couple of examples. In the purchases of goods and services, what we can't do, we can't put a contract in place that's going to pay another grant recipient. That's one example. Hospitality, because the government does not allow the use of alcohol. So that's one thing that's going to be there. In no circumstances can we use tri-agency funds to pay for alcohol. So those are going to be very few and far between in the guide, but those are really specific to what we're not allowed to do at government, just to make sure that that's not being done at the grant recipient level. So as promised, we can use a couple of examples as to how we're going to get away from the prescriptive lists. So we have to ask ourselves in the appropriate use of grant funding a couple of questions. So question number one, what we're spending the money on, is it directly related to research? Seems like a fairly simple question. So if we're able to justify that, yeah, it is, great. We get a checkbox there. One thing I didn't mention that's going to be very important, it's going to be a shift in mindset, is where the institutions provide the same goods and services to everybody at the institution, regardless of its strategy funding or not. So example, if the administrating institution pays for maintenance of labs, then technically the institution should be paying for that out of their operations budget and not pushing that down onto the grant recipient to force you to use grant funding to maintain the labs. So it's kind of there to protect you, to not use grant funding to offset the operational budget of the administering institution. Effective and economical. So example there in the purchase of goods and services. Given that we now have to follow the administrating institutions' policies, if the policy says, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, if the policy says we need to get 3 quotes to purchase a piece of equipment, let's say, excuse me, we go out and get the 3 quotes. It comes back at $5,000, $5,500, and $6,000. There's no hard and fast rule that says we have to take the cheapest. So if we can justify that, you know what, the $5,500 option or the $6,000 option is better because one, it has a longer useful life. You can purchase an additional option that allows you additional flexibility, and you can prove to the fact that it's better value for money. So be it. That's fine. So you don't have to go with the cheapest rate. And not result in personal gain. So one thing that we did see in the past, again, this is few and far between, but it has happened. Somebody traveling around Christmas to go to a conference in their hometown on the 24th and coming back on the 2nd of January. It could be a legit expense. We have to ask a couple questions, but if it turns out that, you know what, like the conference has nothing to do with the research and trying to take advantage of use of grant funding to go home, results in personal gain, well, we can't use grant funding for that. That's kind of an extreme example, but something that we have seen in the past. So that's kind of the idea. So that's how you would use the principle for the appropriate use of grant funding. Number 2 is authority to use grant funds. So as I said, it will all go in the roles and responsibilities that you are actually accountable for the use of grant funds. You would have to authorize the expenditures, and you also have the ability to delegate to someone within your team that has the required knowledge to do so. So either the PI or the delegate has to authorize all of the expenditures, as well as any grant account adjustments as well would have to be authorized by the same people. Reporting and supporting evidence, I don't think this really changes, to be honest. As long as we have an invoice, something to support what we're actually spending our money on. What has changed in the past, I'm not sure if this has been in place for quite some time, but the original receipts aren't required anymore. You can use a photocopy, electronic receipt. That's kind of where we're going with the increased improvement, the overall improvement as we go through. But that's I honestly don't think that's going to change much as to what you're doing now, as well as the oversight of the use of the grant funds. So now that we're relying on the administering institutions' policies, and again, this shouldn't change all that much, I don't think. Anything that kind of looks ambiguous, or I'll give you like an example. What we've seen as well in the past is a researcher using grant funding to purchase toys. You take a look at it real quick, you're like, I'm not too sure about this. So they start asking questions, and it turns out that the researcher was in social sciences, looking at the various behaviors in different families in different settings. So at the end of the day, it wasn't wrong. But the fact that we actually went out and asked additional questions, understood the research, understood why we're actually buying toys, again, around Christmas, kind of, you kind of ask yourself questions once again. But if it's justified and we can put that to the file and say, yeah, we're spending toys for X, Y, Z, and it does relate to the research, that's fine. So again, some institutions are doing a lot of pre-auditing. It doesn't look like absolutely everything, and it doesn't look like that's what we're doing here, which is fantastic. So In areas where the expenditure looks reasonable, I don't think there's going to be a need for additional justification, but examples like the toy example would be something we'd ask for additional justification for. So this is kind of how we're proposing to get away from a more prescriptive list. So really getting away from a list saying, yes, you're allowed, no, you're not allowed. That from here on in for the pilot, and hopefully in the full rollout later on, I'll get to that. I'll get to the timing at the end. This is how we're proposing to go about. So moving forward. So the second part of the initiative really is the financial monitoring. We kind of touched on it a while ago, and you're absolutely right. We will have to be looking at a new way for us to conduct the monitoring research, to get away from the audit approach, to be more of a partner, to increase the level of trust to the grant recipients. But all that to say, we put that on hold. We're taking all these comments into consideration to come up with a new model for financial monitoring. I'm not going to bore you with the details right now because it really doesn't impact you directly as it stands now, but just know that that's actually being done. And areas of debate, so this is the 7th, I think, institution we've visited, 7th or 8th, or the 12th. A lot of the questions came up of the direct versus indirect costs. Who pays for what? How does it disseminate? How does it get to the administering institutions? So it's outside of the scope today. That's what we're doing, but rest assured that's on our radar to have discussions and to further clarify how that fits into this. Communication. So just real quick, we are committed as a tri-agency to provide continuous updates to the initiative. So if you go to science.gc.ca, so the presentation will be shared with you. So if you go there, pretty much what we've included thus far is what the initiative is about, what we've done thus far. Because we're really just kicking it off now, we've identified the participating administering institutions, how we selected them, just trying to be transparent. So as there for anyone that wants updates on the initiative, as we move through and address some of these questions and we find answers, we're going to find a way to communicate the hot topics and the actual progress to date through this site. So it's fairly bare now, but we're just only because we're actually getting into it now. So that's the communication vehicle. What's been completed so far? There's a lot up there, but really consultations. We've consulted through CARA, CABO, the various administrative institutions. We're here now to hear your thoughts. So that's what we've done so far, where we're at today, and really the next steps. As soon as we finalize the principle-based guide, which is what we're working on now, and we share it with the administering institutions to actually officially launch the pilot and test this out. And just real quick, the timelines is the start date is yet to be determined, but it's coming soon. It's very aggressive. We're looking to do the pilot for 6 to 7 months. Anyway, we're saying completion of the pilot by spring 2019. Hopefully it goes well. So that's our intent. So that's kind of like the next steps. So as soon as we go live with this, to find out if these expenditures are eligible, not eligible, don't want to repeat myself, but we're no longer going with the list. We're going to try and apply the principles to see, and if the burden does go down. If not, we would certainly like to know so we can adjust and make it work for everybody. So I think we've covered this slide really as to what's not working, what could potentially not work, which is great feedback, so thank you for that. So the one question, so these are kind of questions for you to help us understand how this could apply. I think we've went through this. Are you aware of the actual institutional policies that are in place now? Because that's going to be key right there, that they're actually aware of what they are, where they are, so that whenever you're asking yourselves these questions, directly related or related, that we take a look at the policies to make sure that it follows the University of Waterloo. So that's the one takeaway, I think, and I think the feedback that I'm getting is we are aware of what the policies are and look where they are. So I'll take silence as golden, so I'll take that as a yes. A couple of risks that have been raised and that we're aware of. So because that we're asking that across the various universities, the grant recipient rely on their host administering institution policies. There could be differences in the various policies. We're aware of that. It is a risk. We don't think, we sitting in Ottawa, behind a desk in Ottawa, don't think it's a major risk that it's going to really dictate as to where you're going to take your research. Like, you're going to go somewhere else because the travel policy is lighter or X, Y, and Z. We don't think so. The feedback we've gotten so far is no. I don't know if you share that answer, but to mitigate this risk as well, just so you know, through the pilot we'll be doing, and I think Natalie touched on it, we'll be doing a policy gap analysis. So pretty much what the directives are, what policies should be in place to be able to assess whether it's eligible or non-eligible. Is there a gap? If there's a gap, like example, I'm just going to, again, if a certain university doesn't have a travel policy, or it's like a weak the travel policy, it doesn't address X, Y, Z, well, we can take a look at the other 11 pilot institutions, see what they have in place, and say, you know what, you guys have like a gap over here, maybe consider best practices and adopt something that the other institutions are doing. That's the idea. Just want to iterate the fact that the intent is not to have one policy fits all. It just doesn't make any sense. It's not going to work. But we're just trying to identify any huge gaps, and if there's any gaps, does it make sense to actually close that gap with revising a policy, creating a policy that would be beneficial to this. That's the idea. And the notion of not normally provided by the institution. Whenever we put this together, we thought it was a fairly simple notion. Talking with the institution so far, and we'll have additional conversations here, it might not be as clear cut. I know there's going to be differences across the universities for sure. That has to be expected. But we've started to learn that within the institutions, the various departments might have different rules there. So I think I know the answer to what that issue is. Don't want to share it with you because I'm not sure if we agree, but no. So we'll be taking a look at that through the pilot discussions between ourselves, between the 12 pilot institutions, through the actual testing of this, of putting an expense through and actually testing it to say, what should Waterloo be paying for and not you? And if there's ambiguity there, we can work through it throughout the pilot. So yeah, just we're nearing the end of the presentation. Just for your information, this is up on science.gc. So the way that we selected the 12 pilot institutions, the idea, we didn't want to select, example, 12 U of T's. We didn't want to select, all the biggest universities. We wanted to consider the various sizes because some universities might have more developed policies. Some are the research office, some are centralized, some are decentralized. So I just want to get like a good mix so that we're not just looking at one subset of the administering institutions. I think we've covered the population of who we're funding, the tri-agency's funding, so we have a good sense of the overall population. Last couple of slides. So this doesn't really impact you, but this is how we're going to be working with the administering institution. Roles and responsibilities are actually being drafted through an MOU. We're planning to we're going to start with monthly conference calls, depending on the feedback and depending on the complexity of issues that are not working, or it might actually work seamlessly, maybe. But if there's a need to have additional conference calls, additional meetings, additional on-site meetings, we'll assess that. We're here to help. We're here to be a partner. We're here to actually work through this together. Service standards to assist pilots. So pretty much any questions, like the first line of contact, and this goes with the last slide with who you should be communicating with, is throughout the pilot, any uncertainty, your first line of defense or your first point of contact really is the administering institution, since we're relying on their policies. If the answer is clear-cut, fantastic. If not, they will come to us. We can have a discussion collectively. There's probably going to be an odd question here or there that's going to come directly to us. In a perfect world, we'd like all the questions to go through the administering institution. That said, we're not going to not answer your question. But we're not going to answer your question without first consulting with the administering institution, because the importance there is the fact that the policies are different across the board. They're the subject matter experts, so we want to make sure that our advice is in line with what the administering institution would actually advise you as well. So that's kind of the idea of the service standards. So we'll actually, the service standards is going to be like in the MOU, so we intend to get an answer to you, or at least say that we're looking at your question within X number of days to make sure that you're not left hanging with a question that's not being addressed. Communication, again, consultations. The use of the science.gc, hopefully that works very well. Again, we'll be working with Waterloo for progress, and not just between Tri-Agency and Waterloo, but also the other pilot institutions to see what's working and what other areas have we not considered. And we'll find a way to disseminate the pertinent information down to you throughout the pilot and at the end of the pilot. One quick correction here, we're not spring. So we're actually in the fall. So this in a nutshell, I've spoken to it a while ago. We're wrapping up the consultations mid-October. I think the last one is the 19th. We've got a draft guide, a principle-based guide, which I think we'll take back the comments and see if we need to make a few tweaks to it. Once that's done, we'll be sharing the guide with the institution. Again, we can talk about an ETA as to when we're actually going to start implementing this. But the idea is to test it throughout the winter, throughout the spring, see where we're at, and hopefully have a successful pilot by spring 2019. That's the idea.